Okay, everyone, Dr. Linda here. We are going to start the endocrine system. So, when we talk about the endocrine system, it's important to kind of make these connections in parallel to another system called the neural system, because the neural system and the endocrine system, they do function together to coordinate all of the systems and bodily functions. And the neural system releases neurotransmitters, right? That's the chemical messenger system that the neural system uses, whereas the endocrine system is using a type of chemical messenger called hormones. And most hormones, as well as neurotransmitters, they're going to circulate through the blood and eventually bind to receptors on target cells. Both hormones and neurotransmitters are going to do that. Now, exocrine, right, we talk about endocrine system, so we have endocrine and exocrine. So exocrine is going to secrete their products into ducts, right? Like the sweat gland has a sweat duct, and the oil glands have an oil duct, and the mammary glands have the mammary ducts. So exocrine glands, just to give a few, we have the sweat gland, which is known as the sudiferous gland. We have sebaceous glands, and sebaceous gland is your oil gland. We have mucus glands, and we have digestive glands, right? These are all part of the exocrine portion, whereas the endocrine portion is going to secrete hormones, and endocrine glands, these do not have ducts, right? Instead, they're going to secrete their hormone directly into the interstitial fluid surrounding them. And these hormones are going to diffuse right into the bloodstream through these capillaries. And eventually, right, the blood's going to carry them to a distant part, to a target cell at a different part of the body. And some endocrine glands include pituitary, thyroid, your parathyroid, adrenal glands, pineal glands. These are just some examples of endocrine. Now, there are certain organs and tissues that are not even part of the endocrine system, but they do secrete hormones because they contain secreting cells. So secreting cells are found in the hypothalamus. Well, the hypothalamus is in the brain. The thymus, the pancreas, the ovaries, right? If we think of the ovaries and the testes, well, these parts are part of the reproductive tract, but they also have secreting cells. The kidneys. The kidneys are part of the urinary system, but they have secreting cells. The stomach is part of the digestive system, but it's got secreting cells. The liver, the small intestine, skin, even the heart. That's right, the heart is part of the cardiovascular system, but it does have secreting cells that secretes atrial natriuretic polypeptide, which can influence its own blood pressure. How neat is that? Fat cells or adipose tissue and even the placenta have secreting cells. So if we look up at the top left, you'll see we have the hypothalamus, and just below it, the pituitary gland. And just below that on the left, we see the thyroid gland. So these three, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the thyroid gland, actually create what we call the HPT axis, the H for hypothalamus, the P for pituitary, and the T for thyroid. Because the hypothalamus can secrete a hormone that goes to the pituitary, and it stimulates the pituitary to release a hormone. And then the pituitary is going to release a hormone that goes to the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland releases a hormone, and it will go to a target cell. So we call it the HPT axis. Now, under the thyroid, you see adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is also connected to the hypothalamus and the pituitary. It's just called the HPA axis. H for hypothalamus, P for pituitary, and A for adrenal gland. So there's an HPT axis, an HPA axis. And these two can actually crosstalk to one another. And it'll probably show up somewhere on this week's discussion board where I'll chime in talking about the HPT and the HPA axis and how they crosstalk to one another. When I think of the adrenals, I'm thinking about stress, the adrenal stress. You may have heard of the term adrenal exhaustion, where people become very sick and tired due to over exertion of the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands can actually be overly stressed and crosstalk to the thyroid and inhibit the thyroid function. So stress can actually create these hypoactive thyroids and inhibit them. So we'll show you that later in the week on the discussion board. Okay, so we look at the hypothalamus up at top. You see that it produces some hormones, ADH, oxytocin. Now, you do have to know what these abbreviations stand for, and it's because in healthcare, most test results are done by abbreviation. So ADH is anti-diuretic hormone. If you look down below at the pituitary, you see ACTH, TSH, GH, PRL, FSH, LH, and MSH. You need to know the abbreviations and what they stand for. Now, there is a slide that's coming up that does have a key that goes over what all these abbreviations stand for. But ACTH stands for Adreno Cortico hormone. And when you look at the term Adreno Corticotropic hormone, adreno from the adrenal gland, cortico from the cortex of the adrenal gland. The term cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree, the external portion, the outer layer. Like the brain has a cortex. It's called the cerebral cortex. It's the outer part of the brain. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. GH, growth hormone. PRL, prolactin releasing hormone. FSH, follicular stimulating hormone. LH, luteinizing hormone. MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Those are the anterior lobe. See on the posterior gland, on the pituitary gland, there's an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. Some books call the anterior lobe the Adreno hypophysis, and then the posterior lobe is sometimes referred to as the neurohypophysis. Those terms are interchangeable. Posterior lobe, neurohypophysis; anterior lobe, adenohypophysis. Look at the posterior lobe. It says it releases oxytocin and ADH. Well, if you look above at the hypothalamus produced oxytocin and ADH. So it leads us to believe that the hypothalamus produces it, and then it's stored in the pituitary gland, but in the posterior lobe. And then the posterior lobe will release the oxytocin and ADH. If we look at the thyroid gland releases T4. The T is for tyrosine. It's an amino acid. And the 4 is how many iodines are attached to tyrosine. So when you have one tyrosine with 4 iodines, it's called thyroxine. When you have one tyrosine with 3 iodines, T3, is called triiodo, right? 3, triiodo for iodine. Thyrionine, that's T3. So T4 and T3. T4 can also be converted into T3, and most of that conversion takes place in the liver, but it is selenium dependent. It needs that mineral selenium. Then the thyroid gland also releases calcitonin. That may be a new one that you may never have heard of before. Most people know T4 and T3, but calcitonin is a really important hormone that the thyroid produces, and it helps to regulate calcium balance. Not just the thyroid, but if you look in the upper right-hand corner, under the pineal gland, it says parathyroid gland. And the parathyroid gland in the purple on the right, it releases parathyroid hormone. That 2, the PTH, that too is a regulator of calcium. So the parathyroid gland, which releases the parathyroid hormone, and the thyroid gland that releases calcitonin, those two hormones are regulating the homeostasis or balance of calcium. Well, why would we need calcium regulation? Why would we need calcium balance? Well, calcium is really important for muscle function, right? We covered muscles already. We know how important calcium is for muscle function. We know that calcium is important for neurotransmitter function. We know calcium is needed for blood clotting. We know that calcium is needed for nerve function, muscle function, clotting. It's a coenzyme, or not a coenzyme, a cofactor that makes many enzyme reactions happen. So calcium is really important. There's a pretty tight window on blood results, usually somewhere between 9 and 11 is that magic number. And if calcium becomes too much or too low, we have problems. I will show you the adrenal glands. We'll make sure that we go through the adrenal glands, showing you the adrenal cortex and the medulla and the hormones that they release, which are slightly different. The adrenal medulla releases norepinephrine and epinephrine, also known as noradrenaline and adrenaline. Noradrenaline and adrenaline, or norepinephrine and epinephrine, are interchangeable terms. The adrenal medulla is the inner part of the adrenal gland, whereas the adrenal cortex is the outer part. And the adrenal cortex releases cortisone, corticosterone, aldosterone, androgens. When we look down on the lower left, we see the pancreas. We have pancreatic islets, sometimes called the islets of Langerhans, which release insulin and glucagon. There are alpha cells and beta cells of the pancreatic islets. The beta cells release insulin, alpha cells release glucagon. Insulin and glucagon are these two antagonistic hormones to one another that are involved in regulating blood sugar. And we'll go through that in a separate slide. The pineal gland on the upper right, you see the pineal gland releases melatonin. Melatonin helps tone you down at night, helps you sleep, helps you relax. Melatonin is a neurotransmitter that doesn't only affect the brain, but has major impact. There's lots of research now on the gut. And you may not have heard of this connection before, but they call it the brain-gut axis, or the brain-gut connection. Another hormone in the brain, not a hormone, a neurotransmitter, you may have heard of serotonin. Well, there are more serotonin receptors in the gut, about 8 to 9 times the amount than there are in the brain. So the brain-gut connection is super important. You may have heard when people get anxious and nervous, they have to run to the bathroom. When people are depressed, they get constipated. When they're anxious, they have diarrhea, right? It's the brain-gut axis. All right, we already covered the parathyroid gland with PTH. We'll go over that again. The heart secretes atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, really important. Your thymus gland produces thymousines. It's part of T cells for your white blood cell count. Adipose tissue, fat cells, release leptin. The digestive tract secretes a variety of hormones that are involved with hunger or appetite, even your sugar or glucose metabolism. Kidneys, really important for secreting EPO, erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone that goes to your bone marrow to produce more red blood cells when you need it. Calcitriol is another way of saying vitamin D. So your kidneys are involved with vitamin D production. And then you have the reproductive portions, the testes and ovaries, that release your sex organs. Okay, so I'm going to take a break here. We'll come back, and in the next video, we'll get into the pituitary.